Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and today is episode 71. ConnectID, 1 year on, is the topic. And our guest today is Dima Postnikov, head of identity and strategy and architecture at ConnectID, and also vice chair of the OpenID Foundation. Welcome, Dima.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me here.
Before we dive into ConnectID, why don't you share with the audience a little bit about your background?
Background, where do you start? I think like a lot of us, I started being a software developer for a long time. Then for a long time, I've recognized the need to manage user records and the need to manage login, authentication, and authorization of users, and slowly shifted into authentication and authorization space. I led the architecture for consumer identity for two largest banks here in Australia, and later on moved on to ConnectID, which is part of Australia Payments Plus, to lead the architecture for ConnectID verification network.
Oh, and so, a lot of us here in the United States don't know a heck of a lot about ConnectID. I was reading the website and it says ConnectID is a digital identity exchange. What does that actually mean?
ConnectID is a network. It's a network of entities that would like to verify consumer identity and the network of providers. So every consumer has entities that they trust and entities that already know them. For example, you already done your know your customer check with your bank, so your bank knows you. The idea behind ConnectID is to bring those entities that you already have a trusted relationship with as your identity provider. So you don't have to create a new identity. You don't have to download a new app, do another identity verification. If your bank is a part of ConnectID, you can verify your identity without any enrollment, with your consent in flow, using your existing customer channels, banking channels, for example.
Are there any identity providers that aren't banks?
Not at the moment. The idea of ConnectID incubated out of conversation between big four banks in Australia, which cover 70% of the market, more or less. But the network itself is open. So we went live with 4 banks. So now we've got 4 banks live. But the idea is it's an open network where other identity providers, government-based, financial services-based, and non-government, non-financial services-based as well in the future. So it's an open network.
So it's possible, but not at the
it's
moment.
possible. Not at the moment, no.
So how does ConnectID differ from an open banking federation, and how is ConnectID similar to an open banking federation?
So the concept is similar in the sense that it's an ecosystem with the federation controller of sorts, governance, network governance entity, which is the role of ConnectID, where multiple parties brought together and they can trust each other. So usually both the difference between open banking and private identity networks like ConnectID is probably voluntary nature of ConnectID versus mandated nature of open banking. So usually with open banking, the government comes and says all the banks have to comply with this regulation and have to share this data in this way. With ConnectID, it's more of a private, commercial, and voluntary scheme where multiple entities came because they think that's the right thing for the economy here. And they've designed a network, and this network has gone live, and they act in as a voluntary participants. But the trust between the participants still need to be established at a lower network and OpenID Connect type of level. And this is where that's a technical trust establishment that ConnectID provides.
Yeah, it seems a lot. So you say actually that ConnectID is a digital identity exchange, but it really sounds like it's a federation. where ConnectID is sort of providing some of the tools and the rules, um, and facilitating this trust between the parties. Isn't that really just a federation?
It is a federation. I think if you and I talk, people
Uh-huh.
from identity community, I think it's more of a federation.
Yeah.
But it's hard to explain it. I think the idea of exchange and the word exchange came from Australian trusted digital identity framework legislation. There is a role that the only role that we can map ourselves to in old TDIF, which is our old Australian identity framework, is identity exchange. But we don't see the data. We're not party to data transfer at all ourselves.
Right.
So data goes directly from an identity provider to a relying party.
Right. And that seems a bit different from an architecture like, what were they called? Secure key in Canada. I think also you leverage bank ID, but was more of a proxy in the middle. And I think did see the data in transit. So you're not a secure key, for example.
No, we don't use the same architecture. And then it's sort of there on purpose. We try to stick as long as possible to the principle where we don't see the data, we don't touch the data, no matter how many times it can be encrypted, decrypted. The simplest way for us to make sure that our participants wouldn't feel nervous about it is not to create another honeypot and not to see the data in any form, whether it's encrypted or not.
Yeah. So how do the economics work? Is this a profit or nonprofit? Who provided the initial capital? And what does success look like for a business like ConnectID?
So I'll start with the last one. I think the successful ConnectID would be becoming true national identity infrastructure for Australia. That's what we're aiming for. We started off with sort of small scale pilots, and initially it originated from 4 banks talking to each other. But the reasons for the network's existence is not necessarily commercial. Probably not significant amount of revenues the banks can generate from it. I think it's a lot of participants in the network understand that that's the right thing to do for the economy. I don't know if you keep an eye on what's happening in Australia. Australia is specifically being hurt a lot by the data breaches. So the population here is very, very sensitive when they have to supply their data, especially their data and the documents and metadata about their documents to reliant parties that are not necessarily able to keep it secret. There have been, I think it's fair to say that by now, every Australian's data has been breached with one massive provider or another. So the idea behind ConnectID is to minimize the data. So you should stop relying on the documents to verify everyone's identity, because everyone's got a copy of your documents now. And you should start relying on the trusted providers that can authenticate you properly, like the banks. Or the source of, or in the future, the sources of identity, like the government. So a lot of government agencies, they are responsible for the source of your identity. Right. And they could be providing this directly to the network as well. In terms of commercial opportunities, I think the basic principle that behind ConnectID network as well is identity providers have done significant amount of work to establish KYC, know your customer, but also authenticate you on an ongoing basis. So they do get rewarded per transaction.
Okay, so
and relying parties pay.
It's interesting because one of the challenges of federations is that they never end. Like, it's not a project that gets started on this date and ends on this date. It like just keeps going forever. And so for something like that, one of the challenges is that it's hard to operate a federation. There's technical infrastructure, even if you're not seeing the data. There's still, you're onboarding participants, you're vetting participants, you're changing rules as data, rules evolve, as you mentioned in Australia. So I'm wondering, maybe if you guys have solved the puzzle down there of how to build a business, a self-sustaining economic model around this federation. Um, so the identity providers clearly have done this work KYCing and providing an authentication server. But what about ConnectID itself? Is it the mission of ConnectID to sign up more and more relying parties, and that's where you'll see your revenue? And so, in a way, to get the relying parties to help fund this endeavor, or how does ConnectID, the business, actually grow? And and how does it sort of offset the expenses for for all the infrastructure and management and like people like yourselves, highly trained expert people to run this thing?
Just like you said, it's a number of reliant parties that will drive the number of transactions, and ConnectID essentially will get a portion of the transaction fee that the IDP gets, similar to Visa and MasterCard type of networks, and that's how the network can become sustainable.
I see. So the participants, are they paying an onboarding fee? Because I imagine a fair amount of work it takes. So it's all transaction fee based is where the revenue streams will come from?
Yes. Maybe I'll give you a brief overview where ConnectID sits in the Australian economy. So ConnectID is one of the schemes that's run by Australian Payments Plus. Australian Payments Plus runs other payment-related schemes. So we've got fast payments network, we've got billing network payment, and in-store payment network like EFTPOS. So those schemes have been running for years. And Australian Payments Plus is what they call profit for purpose, owned by members. So the members of Australian Payments Plus are large banks, large retailers, and some other companies as well, quite a lot of companies. So the idea behind ConnectID is to run a scheme that will benefit Australian economy. And that's why we started off with a large investment into the network, into accreditation process, into bringing all the reliant parties and IDPs on board, with a view that this is the best thing for Australian economy. And no, so at the moment we don't have the accreditation fee, but there is a fair amount of effort that goes into accrediting and testing and bringing to life every reliant party and especially every IDP. So it's true there is a large amount of effort, but the company is keen to invest. The company is keen to invest with the view that in the future it will pay off.
And so is this joint owned by the IDPs here, or is it owned by the Australian government? Or I don't quite understand how did you get the activation energy in order to get this effort like started, which sounds like it's been a lot of work, even just 1 year into it.
Oh, it has been a lot of work, and I think it's been going for some of us, been going for 5 years, where we started some of those conversations. So it took a long time. So ConnectID is a part of Australian Payments Plus. Australian Payments Plus is owned by members. And yes, our 4 large IDPs at the moment are our members. So they do part own the network as well. But there are a lot of other companies, and there will be IDPs in the future that don't form part of membership in Australian Payments Plus. And we don't have government as our member.
It's a really interesting model. I don't know of any other countries that have the similar models where the IDPs, whether they're banks or telco or whoever, jointly own and operate a federation. Do you know of any other countries who do something like this?
I think to a certain extent, there are some parallels with BankID in Nordics. There are some parallels with SelectID that's been kicked off recently in the UK as well. It's also participant-owned networks.
But
it is important. Sorry, I was just going to say it is important, and I guess we're pretty lucky that the conversation started with 4 large identity providers deciding that's the right thing to do. So we didn't have to spend too much effort convincing them. If we started a network on our own and then went off trying to convince reliant parties to use it and identity providers to join, that would be a much harder job for us to do. The fact that we had such strong participation from the banks, and I came from a bank as well. When the initiative started, I was working for one of the banks. That helped a lot. So the participants, they're not just participants. I think they're part of the strategy.
Right.
They're part of the strategic network building exercise all the time.
Okay. So switching to the tech a little bit, ConnectID promises you'll always have control over your data when and where your data is shared. That sounds a little bit too good to be true in today's surveillance world. I feel like my data is everywhere and I have no control. So I'm just wondering, is that a little bit, how does that actually work? Like, you're really just talking about the data that you've shared through your network, right? But
That's
how
right.
does it actually work that, let's say I go to, I log in somewhere and I decide, oh, I want to remove my records. So if I have control, that implies I should be able to go to that RP and say delete all my records. How does this work? How does this work? How does the end user actually get control of their data through ConnectID?
So one of the basic principles that we pursued from the very beginning is every transaction and every movement of the data has to be consent-based. So customer always has to consent. There is nothing implied about
Right.
ConnectID consent. It's always explicit consent when any data, no matter what amount of data, whether it's just over 18 flag or it's full first name, last name, date of birth, and so on, customer has to consent. It's IDPs, so the network prescribes IDPs to first capture that consent. So it's non-negotiable. For every transaction, there is the whole CX guidelines, scheme rules, how those things should happen. That's the first part. The second part is every IDP maintains the visibility of what transactions or what data has been shared with whom and when. Not necessarily a specific data, but what type of data has been shared. So every IDP has a dashboard where you can go and historically check. I've shared my data with car rental company here on that date, and I've shared those attributes. I've shared my first name, last name with another company. So all of that's supposed to be maintained. So there's definitely a visibility to customers. They can see where they share their data. They can go back and challenge it if required. And the third point is every participant in ConnectID network is also party to Australian privacy law. And at the moment, it's a voluntary enrollment in the Australian privacy principles, but we mandate and ask our reliant parties and our IDPs to enroll into Australia privacy principle. Even if it's voluntary, they have to do it. And that comes with another set of obligations to make sure that every entity uses the data only for the declared purpose, and so on and so on.
I see. So the way that this works as a federation operator, since you're not actually operating this infrastructure, you don't actually have the data, is that you set basically a set of guidelines for here are the type of consents that you must ask the user, but also you must provide a dashboard so that the user can revoke their consent if they change their mind. Is that how you do it basically, is you have a set of guidelines or for your identity providers who and RPs? Is that fair?
There is a set of standards, there are a set of guidelines, scheme rules that every entity has to comply with. Yeah.
And
through different levels. It goes all the way from the technical standard to sort of some of the optional guidelines and mandatory guidelines, especially in the UX space. And there are certain scheme rules which come with eligibility criteria. Every it's not just every customer of every bank can be necessarily sharing an identity using ConnectID. There is a whole set of eligibility rules that needs to be applied. Customer needs to be KYC, customer needs to be not deceased, customer needs to be having access to online and not have any active fraud investigations against or around their identity. So there is a set of eligibility rules that IDPs have to enforce as well, and that all comes through scheme rules.
So one of the features that's really interesting is that the ConnectID offers sort of a type of selective disclosure where you don't have to release all of your information to a relying party. Is that is that something a la carte where the end user can choose, or does a certain relying party get, let's say, authorized for a certain type of data, and then as long as they're authorized for that type of data, they get all the data, or does the end user get any type of more granular control over, well, I don't want to share my address or my phone number with this particular RP?
It's probably all of the above. So there are different levels. When Reliant Party joins ConnectID network, we have a sort of serious conversation around use case exploration, and we always trying to minimize the data that they will always question if we think they're asking for too much data. We're trying to minimize the data movement because ultimately it does contribute to our privacy preserving image in Australia. And at the end of the accreditation, Reliant Party, if they justify that we need those attributes, they will be accredited for those attributes. So they can only request those attributes and not the other ones. For example, we have Reliant Parties that can only ask for one attribute, over 18 flag. That's all. For their use case, that's been agreed that that's enough. They don't need anything else. We have some Reliant Parties that are accredited for all attributes that we can possibly get from an identity provider. It depends on the use case. So that's the first part. The second part is during the actual request, Reliant Party might be accredited for 5 attributes, but they can still ask for 3. So they still have that freedom to ask for less, depends on the specific circumstances for that particular customer. Maybe they're doing progressive profiling, they don't need as much data at the moment, they might need it later. So we are encouraging them to ask less if possible. And then for certain attributes, there's also a concept of a sort of voluntary claims that can be requested, but customer can choose not to share them. So for those attributes, because it has to make it, at the end of the day, the collection of the attributes coming back has to make sense to Reliant Party, because if they don't have enough attributes to complete their use case, this transaction becomes useless to them. So, but they can choose some of the attributes. For example, we don't actually need it, but it would be nice to have, so they can indicate that using essential, non-essential claims, and the IDPs will give a customer a choice to deselect them or select them. So there are multiple levels how the data can be sort of filtered down to what they receive. And we have enforcement on the IDP side, where they're requesting for something they're not allowed to. If Reliant Party is requesting for something that they don't allow to be requesting, transaction will be rejected.
I see. So ConnectID offers RPs a number of different services. It seems like the onboarding service would be super useful for retailers to lower the friction. But there's also age verification, digital signing, payments integration. I'm guessing, is onboarding sort of the number one use case here?
Probably. I think onboarding to a certain extent, authentication, if you choose, you can choose to use ConnectID for ongoing authentication as well. But I think most of the Reliant Parties, from what I can see, it's either onboarding or potentially making sure the customer is over 18 if they purchase something that's supposed to be purchased by people over 18. Right. That's a majority. I think some of the other features that you mentioned, like digital signatures and payments, that's a future work that's in a roadmap right now.
Great. What about just citizenship? I could see a service where a company might say, well, I just need to know that this person's an Australian citizenship. Is that something that you offer?
This is where we would like to work with the government as identity providers or attribute providers to make sure it can be plugged in. I think it's definitely been asked for. A lot of it is in the context of do you have a right to work? Do you have a visa that allows you to work, for example, for your employee onboarding? That's super useful. And this is what we're trying to work with Australian state and federal governments to make sure that we can plug in more attributes into the network to make it more useful. At the end of the day, it's not just about identity. It's for reliant parties, identity is just the first step. A lot of times they need to do more. They need to, I need to check your visa as well. I need to check your credit history. I need to check your credit score. So all of those things that they are part of onboarding for a lot of entities. And the idea is to expand ConnectID beyond just basic identity. Identity is just a start that allows you to link a particular person between multiple organizations, right?
Right. It sounds quite challenging because if you say, well, the government's authoritative for citizenship or visa status, then you have to correlate that person somehow with the government, and maybe that can be done through like an identifier. I don't know if there's a social security number but then that gets tricky because you have these correlatable identifiers that are tricky. But do you see that being a direction where maybe you're becoming a ConnectID becomes a way to facilitate like an attribute exchange, not just an identity exchange?
That's right. So I think at the end of the day, identity is just a set of attributes, and they could be coming from different places. I think correlation is definitely a problem that we'll need to solve once we start plugging those additional identity attributes and non-identity attributes that come from other places. A lot of it can be done by reliant parties themselves if they have the context, but a lot of it will probably have to come up with some clever privacy-preserving solutions. Australia, like the US, to a certain extent, like US, like UK, we don't have an identifier, one single identifier, that sort of government issue that we can use, especially in the private sector. Yes and no. I think it would have been easier, but I think it creates a challenge from an identity systems perspective. But at the same time, it's a privacy preserving opportunity.
Yeah. So one of the services I noticed on the list was digital signing, and do you have any customers or any RPs using that in production today?
No. So it's digital signatures on our roadmap. We've launched last year. So ConnectID has launched about a year ago now. We've launched with immediately with I think 2 out of the 4 large banks. Now in the last year, we've focused on what we call minimal lovable product that allows us to build out the basic set of features that are available from every identity provider in a similar, consistent way. And now we're looking at developing other features like document signing. So at the moment, and there is none in production, but there'll be some in the future.
Yeah, it's a super interesting idea because not to pick on DocuSign, but DocuSign's really popular here in the US. But it's kind of bullshit. Like, basically the only thing they verified is my email address. They really know very little about me. So they don't have a strong identity and they don't have strong authentication and they don't have a strong account recovery system. So yes, I believe that they do a good job protecting their private keys, but their ability to actually identify me is based on nothing. So I could see the value prop of digital signing being quite interesting in your ecosystem.
And it's not really with DocuSign or similar providers. I think it also relates to the legislative framework. For example, EU has done sort of arguably great job in terms of making digital signatures recognizable in court. And they created an architecture with the IDAS1 that allows digital signatures to be used. And they have different levels of assurance where providers like DocuSign can participate in and provide assurance to consumers of the service, so business consumers of the service, that the customer has been properly authenticated, properly authorized. We don't have anything like that in Australia from the regulator's perspective. but it does feel like a gap. Most of the document signing providers, like you mentioned, if you look at authentication authorization part, it immediately every identity person will recognize, yeah, there's a lot of room to improve. So I agree.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we'll stay tuned. And besides, let's say, onboarding, authentication, age verification, digital signing, what are there any other areas that you see as particularly interesting for growth for ConnectID?
I think from ConnectID perspective, it's a number of features, number of attributes, number of different providers, non-government, non-bank providers in the future as well. So that's where we see the expansion, apart from growing the network itself. So the focus really to create a toolbox that allows reliant parties to do as complete as possible set of onboarding tools, where they trying to assess the credit worthiness of a customer, or they trying to sell them some sort of a product. In terms of specific use cases, I think that's probably the most surprising part, that while it can be mostly classified as onboarding, the number of use cases that came to us, some of them we're not even aware that they're use cases. Ultimately, we provide the data, and it's up to reliant parties to create use cases that make sense to them. There are some industries that have high regulation, and there are some industries that choose, or some reliant parties that choose to do it because they feel it's the right thing for them to do. And then they create use cases around things that we haven't been aware that there is a problem there at all. For example, one of the reliant parties looking at maintenance of rental homes and who is allowed to come in and maintain that home. I think the authorization and identification of people that can do it can also be solved. Some of the other reliant parties looking at applying for rent or applying to buy a house, identifying yourself pre-auction
Right.
for the house, and the actual use cases varies a lot, and that's the exciting part. It's not just about signing or sign up.
Yeah, yeah, and that's where I thought some of the digital signing could also be interesting. Like you could onboard to maybe buy a car or fill out a loan application, let's say with a third party, not with your bank.
That's right.
Actually, I want to pivot a little bit, conscious of the time, but verifiable credentials and wallets, as you know, in your work at OpenID Foundation, this is like a lot of change. Probably the most innovation right now is happening in this wallet, verifiable credential. OpenID is really at the forefront of this too. So I know you're reading a lot and probably following it closely. Do you think that the work that's being done on wallets and VCs will have any impact on ConnectID?
100%. So I think one of the key principles in the architecture design of ConnectID was always we trying to build a trust network. The data exchange part, we should be agnostic to a specific standard. We started off with something that our banks and ourselves were very, very familiar with, OpenID Connect and FAPI. This is something that we're comfortable with, and we can go ahead. But the idea was we build the trust between the participants, and there are some use cases that in the future will be ideally taken care of by the wallets and verifiable credentials. So we're definitely looking at how we plug in verifiable credentials into ConnectID network, and what do we need to change, and what do we need to change in a trust model. I look at it slightly differently, potentially, to some of the other approaches. Rather than saying it's one or another, or one replaces another, I'm looking at how can we augment the existing IDPs. Sometimes it makes sense to go back to the source, and that's actually what the use case dictates. Sometimes it's perfectly okay to use verifiable credential. Sometimes you need to use an in-person presentation where the wallets that are coming, there's nothing anyone can do about it. The wallets are probably a better way of delivering identity to a Reliant party in store. And the other important bit on the wallet size, when we start talking about correlating the data sources, multiple data sources, multiple attributes, the wallets can be very useful too in trying to present the identity that's coming from different sources. It's just creating the presentation based on verifiable credentials that come from different sources. So there are some opportunities that are not possible in a standard OpenID Connect world. But also that doesn't mean that we're replacing it 100%. So I think there is a place for both. And I always keep saying, as an architect, I want to have both in my toolbox. Depends on the type of interaction, depends on what Reliant party needs, depends on what IDP needs. We can come up with the right tool for the job. And wallets definitely have space there.
I think some people sort of hope that they can ignore some of the federated identity infrastructure and leapfrog directly to this new world of wallets and verifiable credentials, and just sort of be like, okay, well, we didn't have to do that old centralized federated thing. We're just going to jump to this new decentralized, quote unquote, wallet thing. But one challenge that I have with that is that actually, as you sort of alluded to, what the way that I see it is that verifiable credentials are going to add more complexity onto our existing federation infrastructure. Um, and especially one piece of complexity that I see is that ConnectID is fundamentally a trust network, right? You're establishing trust between the issuers and the relying parties. Now we have this other thing, this other entity, which is the wallet, which is another party to this equation. So we don't just have the issuer and the relying party. We now also have the wallet, and the wallet itself needs to be trusted. And this would imply to me that the trust framework would have to somehow incorporate the wallet as an entity. For example, and just to make this real because it gets very abstract, here in the US, if you want to get on an airplane and you want to present your driver's license, the TSA only accepts that presentation from an Apple wallet. So to me, it seems like as ConnectID, you're going to have to say not only, are these the trusted issuers and these are the trusted relying parties, but it seems like you're going to have to figure out a way to carve out some type of rules for this new thing, which is like it has to be a credential presented from this type of wallet. Do you have any thoughts on what are the trust or the sort of impact to the rules of the federation for this new verifiable credential infrastructure?
There is a lot there. So I think you're right. A lot of self-sovereign identity networks started off with principle that we don't need to constrain wallets, we don't need to constrain verifiers. We just need to trust that the issuer has issued to a right person, and from there onwards, you don't need to constrain. But a lot of efforts in EIDAS space and even now in MDL space, they start looking at how do we constrain, how do we accredit, how do we vet Reliant parties to make sure that the data doesn't go just anywhere. And Reliant parties need to understand how do they trust wallets and which wallets they can trust or not. The journey started with a lot of issuers creating their own wallets, which in my view kind of was breaking self-sovereign principles of identity, but they were creating their own wallet. It's a government wallet presenting government verifiable credentials, for example. Then the platforms came in, which they've done a great job with the user experience and delivering certain credentials to masses. And then where I see it evolving next is third-party wallets. So at the end of the day, we'll probably have all three categories of wallets, and the Reliant party and the customer would need to have some sort of a trust mark from an entity that they trust, whichever scheme they're participating in, I can trust this wallet, but I can't trust another wallet. Or I can have those features with this wallet, but this wallet will provide me only with a subset of features. So we will have to deal with it. There will be an impact on the trust infrastructure, and simplistically, from a technical perspective, it's just a different set of roles. Reliant party role will probably stay more or less the same, but instead of having OP or IDP role, it will be a split role between a wallet and an issuer. And then there is some work that there are new specifications that are being created in this space, looking at what can be done to accommodate new types of roles coming from verifiable credential space in federation, for example, which is one of the ways of doing this infrastructure, which I know you're very familiar with.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting. It takes a long. I feel like it sometimes takes longer to make the rules than the tools, and
Yeah.
the tools are taking a long time themselves. I don't know how many versions of the OpenID verifiable credential specs there's been, but there's been a lot. So the tools have been hard, but I see the rules potentially being even harder.
It is. It's always about the interpretation of what you're getting, because it's all about the trust. Every participant in a network or in an interaction needs to understand that they can trust, or to what level, to what extent they need to trust, so they can trust a certain credential from a certain wallet, from a certain issuer. So all of that needs to be translated and simplified. With some credentials, it might be pretty easy. But with some other credentials, you might need the help of a scheme, and this is where the schemes come in and help. For example, if I get a credential from an entity that claims to be a German bank, usual example I use, I don't know if they're a German bank. I don't know who granted them the license and what's financial infrastructure set up in Germany at all. Do they have a reserve bank like in Australia that grants them licenses, or do they have another authority? I need someone to tell me that this entity can be trusted. And just saying I'm a bank might not be enough. It needs to be coming from the authority that I can trust, or someone that I can trust needs to tell me that I can trust someone else that says, yep, that's a bank.
So I've been working with some developing nations through the DPGA, the Digital Public Goods Alliance.
Yep.
And a lot of their concern is around foundational identity. How do we issue that equivalent of the birth certificate or that other foundational identity? But let's just say foundational identity is in place. Do you think that the Connect ID model can be replicated by developing nations where resources are maybe more scarce? But do you think it's worthwhile to form this type of federation to encourage usage of these credentials across the not just for access to government services, but also for the private private organizations too?
In theory, yes. I think the model we have created pretty clean model from the trust architecture perspective, and it can be replicated. I think the key differences that probably start playing a role in the decision whether you should do it or you shouldn't do it is probably how much people trust the government, how much they're willing to have a single identifier versus not single identifier, whatever they prefer. Different countries clearly have a bias towards some countries trust government a lot and they prefer all identity come from the government and they're comfortable with that. Some other countries, for example, like Australia, they tend to be more averse to accepting that the government will do everything for you. In some countries, potentially, you don't have a choice. That's just a given, and you don't have a say which one you trust, which one you don't. Everyone is mandated to use a certain type of identity. So it really depends on a specific country, their setup, their culture. So the answer is it depends, really. But it can be replicated in a sense that it's a federation concept. It's a trust network concept. And everyone, so what we've done, to a certain extent, it's not unique. EI does too, is creating a federation of sorts of, well, it might be based on both, but it's still a federation of countries with their own identity providers, issuers, wallets, and verifiers, and they're all trying to interconnect it. So every other scheme that's been created out there, it needs to establish trust infrastructure. It can be lightweight, it can be heavyweight, it can be verifiable credentials based, it can be more federated approaches based on OpenID Connect, or it could be even custom. There are a lot of custom solutions out there too, and some of them pretty successful in the past.
Well, we're a little over time. I'm just going to get in one last question and we'll go to last thought. But I want to bring it back to, in the homework, there was a blog, I think, that Andrew wrote, and he said, well, 1 year on, the digital identity landscape in Australia is drifting apart rather than converging. Why do you think he said that? Do you know what he means by that? And why do you think he said that?
Potentially. I think that's sort of been part of Australian landscape, that we've got different initiatives evolving in parallel without necessarily being connected. So we've got federal government trying to do something in identity space, mostly focusing on government services at the moment. There's a old MyGovID app that allows you to access some of the federal government services. Each state government is doing their own thing at the moment. Well, they started off doing their own thing in terms of they have certain credentials that are state issued. Driver's licenses are some of those. There's a great initiative done at the moment by Austroads trying to harmonize digital driver's licenses across the state. So hopefully the state governments will be more aligned in terms of how they issue those credentials and how they present it to the rest of the market, and hopefully they will be opened up to the private entities. There are some private efforts and some private solutions in the market. For example, there's Australia Post identity solution, there's ConnectID Network, which brings another sort of place in identity space. I'm hoping that all of those initiatives, one way or another, will converge to simplify life for the consumers, citizens, and for reliant parties. But at the moment, a lot of it is still separate. There is a lot of work that we are doing at the moment at more focusing on the standard space to make sure that the moment the government says, yeah, we're happy to cooperate with you here, our standards are ready and we can certainly plug in from a technical perspective. But that's the hope.
I see. So any last thoughts? Anything, if you want to pitch anything you're doing at OpenID Foundation or ConnectID, but this is your 90 seconds to give whatever message you want, Dima.
Let me think about it. I think from ConnectID perspective, briefly, I think it's an exciting time for us. We've got a core product. The core product is live. Now it's all about scale and making sure that reliant parties and consumers and our identity providers are successful. So we've got something tangible that can be developed, tweaked. We can see how it behaves. It became real a year ago, and that's super exciting. From OpenID Foundation perspective, there is a lot of work going on in the standards, and there's a lot of push and there's a lot of urgency around those standards. There is a great bunch of people working within the standards body, yourself included. And it's pretty exciting to see how some of those in the past separate technologies, whether it's SSI or MDL or OpenID Connect, how they converging to make sure that it's much easier for the rest of the market to adopt some of those technologies. I'm looking forward to that. And the only other point I'll make, I think in OpenID Foundation, we also clearly recognize that there is a separate role in the market now, ecosystem governor or ecosystem provider, that requires different set of needs to be satisfied. And part of the thing that we'll be doing in the future is setting up a community group for the ecosystem operators like ConnectID, like MyGov in Australia, like potentially Interact in Canada and other places, SelectID in the UK, to focus on the needs of ecosystem providers. Because it's very different. It's someone needs to connect multiple specifications, because that's what we've been focusing today. There's multiple specifications, but someone needs to connect them, bring them together, and roll it out. And that's a very different set of skills that's required.
Great. Well, I want to congratulate you guys. It's one of the most interesting and advanced federations, I think, out there. And it's a great example. So it's super exciting, the work that you're doing. And yeah, I'm really interested to follow it and see what new innovations you guys come up with in the next couple of years. So yeah, so thank you for joining us. I just want to make a quick announcement for anyone who's watching, who's made it through 50 minutes of this live stream. If you haven't followed Identity Office Hours live stream on LinkedIn, please do that. We can stream directly to the channel when we get to 1,000 followers. So help us get there. Next week, I mentioned foundational identity. Next week we'll have an episode on MOSIP, which is a platform, an open source platform that helps governments build a foundational identity layer. That's been very successful. And we'll have one of the head of engineering on, and actually the head of digital identity from Ethiopia will be on, who's a user of MOSIP. So we're just going to try and cover the basics of what MOSIP does and how it's worked. But hopefully anyone out there join us next week. Dima, thank you again for joining us. And thank you, audience.